December 12, 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. A pale winter sun climbed over the misty horizon, painting the frost-covered fences in a dull silver glow. Beyond the wire, hundreds of German prisoners stood in quiet lines, steam rising from their breath into the cold American morning. The war in Europe still raged, but here, thousands of miles away, time seemed to pause. An American sergeant unlocked the gate and motioned for the line to move. The men stepped forward, boots crunching on frozen dirt. Each handed a tray. Eggs, bread, coffee. No shouting, no humiliation. Only discipline, routine, and an unexpected sense of calm. One of the younger Germans, his hands trembling from the chill, looked up and murmured, "Danke, Sergeant." The American nodded once. Nothing more was said. A radio played faintly from the guard post. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade drifting through the fog. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Enemies by uniform, equals by conduct. Here, amid barbed wire and discipline, humanity had quietly survived the war. By late 1943, the war's balance had shifted. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps had been driven into surrender. In Italy, the Allies were advancing north, capturing thousands of German soldiers every week. Across the Atlantic, the United States found itself facing an unexpected logistical challenge: how to hold, feed, and process an army of captured enemies. The answer came in the form of sprawling, heavily regulated prisoner-of-war camps built across America. From Texas to Virginia, from Alabama to California, more than 400 camps would eventually hold nearly 425,000 German soldiers by war's end. They arrived on ships escorted by the U.S. Navy, blindfolded through the first days of captivity, uncertain whether they'd face torture, starvation, or worse. Many expected brutality. Instead, they found clean clothes, medical care, and food, rations nearly identical to those given to American troops. This humane treatment wasn't an accident. It was a calculated decision rooted in both law and morality. The U.S. Army, following the 1929 Geneva Convention, mandated that every captured soldier, regardless of nationality or allegiance, must be treated with dignity. The principle was clear: do unto your prisoners as you'd wish your own to be treated. In the chaos of global war, such idealism was rare, but America enforced it meticulously. Still, this policy wasn't purely moral idealism. The War Department knew that good treatment of German POWs would serve a larger purpose. It would encourage reciprocity, protecting captured American airmen and soldiers in Europe. Every loaf of bread offered in Alabama was a silent negotiation for the safety of a U.S. pilot somewhere over the Rhine. As trainloads of prisoners arrived at night under tight security, the people of rural America watched in disbelief. To many civilians, these were the same Nazis their sons were dying to defeat. Yet, within the wire fences, the atmosphere quickly took a different tone. The POWs were disarmed, disciplined, but respected. They were allowed to keep their ranks, salute their officers, and even hold roll calls under German regulation, under American supervision. Each camp functioned like a small, self-contained town. There were hospitals, kitchens, chapels, even makeshift theaters. Red Cross officials visited regularly to ensure compliance. German doctors treated German patients under the watch of U.S. medics. If a prisoner worked, picking cotton, repairing roads, or helping with the harvest, he was paid a small wage in camp coupons. For many, it was the first time they earned honest money. Letters were censored, but permitted. Families back in Germany received carefully inspected notes, often describing conditions as better than expected, or even good. One camp report noted that prisoners at Camp Swift, Texas, had gained an average of 10 pounds within 2 months of arrival, a striking contrast to the starvation in Europe. By the end of 1944, this quiet order had transformed into something remarkable. The enemy soldiers began to shed their fear. They still longed for home, but many admitted that they had been misled by propaganda. One captured lieutenant wrote, "We were told Americans would shoot us. Instead, they fed us." Behind the fences, far from the chaos of the front lines, a strange irony unfolded. In captivity, these men, trained to kill, were being introduced to the very ideals their regime had condemned: fairness, discipline, and humanity. The war was reshaping not just nations, but minds, and soon this unexpected decency would grow into something far deeper. By early 1944, America's prisoner of war system had evolved into one of the largest humanitarian experiments of the Second World War. Camps like Camp Swift in Texas, Fort Hunt in Virginia, and Camp Aliceville in Alabama became models of structured coexistence, military order blended with moral restraint. While Europe burned, these isolated compounds represented a paradox, the enemy being treated not as monsters, but as men. The Geneva Convention had laid the foundation, but what emerged went far beyond paperwork. U.S. commanders insisted that German prisoners receive the same meals, shelter, and medical attention as American troops stationed nearby. Red Cross inspectors verified these conditions, often leaving with reports that surprised neutral nations. POWs slept on proper bunks, not straw. They had blankets, stoves, and clean water. Diseases that decimated Eastern Front prisoners under Soviet captivity were almost non-existent in America. At Camp Aliceville, one of the largest German POW camps, over 6,000 men lived behind barbed wire under Alabama's humid sun. The U.S. Army engineers who designed it ensured each compound had recreation fields, chapels, canteens, and even libraries. German prisoners could borrow English books, learn trades, and attend classes organized by American chaplains and sympathetic officers. For men indoctrinated under totalitarian propaganda, this sudden exposure to openness, even from their captors, was disarming. The U.S. government had another motive: to deconstruct Nazi ideology through experience, not force. Psychological officers quietly observed camp dynamics. They encouraged democratic habits, voting for camp representatives, holding debates, and allowing free discussion. The result was subtle but profound. Inside the wire, the Third Reich's soldiers began to encounter ideas they had never known: freedom, fairness, and equality under rules that applied even to enemies. Still, not all camps were peaceful at first. Fanatic Nazi loyalists often tried to intimidate or punish fellow prisoners who showed signs of softness toward Americans. The U.S. eventually separated these extremists from moderates, isolating hardliners in stricter camps. Once removed, a noticeable calm settled over most facilities. Guard reports described cooperation, mutual respect, and even moments of shared laughter during inspections or sport. The locals outside the fences were another story. Many Americans were uneasy about feeding Hitler's soldiers while their own sons fought overseas. But the War Department launched quiet public campaigns explaining that fair treatment protected American POWs abroad. Gradually, skepticism gave way to curiosity. In small southern and midwestern towns, farmers began to request POW laborers for harvest work. It was cheaper, efficient, and unexpectedly humanizing. Under strict supervision, German prisoners picked cotton, cut timber, and repaired roads, often side by side with American civilians. To many locals, the realization came slowly. These weren't monsters from propaganda posters. They were young men, polite, disciplined, often grateful for simple decency. After long workdays, they'd return behind the wire singing folk songs, a haunting reminder that the enemy too had a home and heart. For the prisoners, it was transformative. They saw kindness without weakness, authority without cruelty. One recalled later, "In America, I learned what real order meant, not fear, but respect." By the time 1945 approached, word had spread among captured units: if you must surrender, surrender to the Americans. But this atmosphere of respect was more than policy or propaganda. It was becoming something personal, built on human moments, small gestures, and moral courage that defied the nature of war itself. Soon, that quiet decency inside the fences would turn into letters of gratitude and lifelong memories that even peace could not erase. For many German soldiers, the first days in American captivity were marked by disbelief. They had been taught that surrender meant dishonor, that capture by the Allies meant humiliation or death. But when they arrived at U.S. camps, the reality broke every expectation. At Camp Swift, Texas, A prisoner named Ernst Becker, once a sergeant in the Afrika Korps, later wrote that the Americans treated us as soldiers, not animals. He recalled how a U.S. medic patched his infected wound, shaking his hand afterward. That single act, he said, felt more victorious than any battle. Across hundreds of camps, similar moments repeated. Quiet, unrecorded gestures that carried more weight than orders or speeches. To the guards, many of whom were barely older than the prisoners they watched, this humanity was instinctive. They saw weary young men who had fought because they were told to, not because they wanted to. The U.S. soldiers followed orders to treat all POWs according to the Geneva Convention, but often went beyond it. Cigarettes were shared. Conversations began, first in broken English, then with laughter and story. One American lieutenant noted in his diary, "You start to see them not as Nazis, but as people who just ran out of luck." The war had drawn lines in blood, but daily life blurred them. In some camps, prisoners volunteered to help build community spaces or plant gardens. They carved toys for local children, played soccer matches against American teams, and even hosted art exhibitions within the camp walls. In this fragile coexistence, both sides rediscovered something that the front lines had buried: empathy. Behind the U.S. policy of humane treatment was a deeper conviction, rooted in democratic ideals. American officers believed that how they treated their captives said as much about the United States as any victory on the battlefield. The contrast with Axis camps was striking. Reports filtering in from Europe spoke of starvation, forced labor, and execution. American commanders wanted the opposite, a moral counterpoint to fascism. Major General Alan W. Gullion, who oversaw the POW program, stated bluntly, "If we act like them, we become them." This wasn't sentimentality. It was strategy grounded in ethics. The U.S. wanted its conduct to reflect the values it was fighting for. Treating prisoners with respect became both a weapon of morality and an assertion of ideological strength. It proved that democracy didn't need cruelty to command loyalty. Many guards, shaped by small-town values and Christian teachings, viewed decency not as weakness, but as duty. Chaplains visited the camps regularly, offering prayers and lessons open to all. Some German prisoners, seeing faith without propaganda, were deeply moved. Years later, a former POW named Rudolf Böhme wrote, "It was the first time I saw religion without hate." This moral consistency built quiet admiration. Many Germans, raised under years of totalitarian control, encountered something they'd been told didn't exist: fairness from an enemy. The American camps didn't just feed and shelter, they reconditioned minds. Away from the iron grip of Nazi authority, thousands of prisoners began reflecting on what they had believed and what they had done. The shift often began with small realization: a guard treating a prisoner's injury without expecting obedience, a camp commandant addressing a captured major with respect, a local family sending food for Christmas. Each act chipped away at the indoctrination that had defined the German military psyche. Psychologists attached to the U.S. Army, such as those in Fort Hunt's secret P.O. Box 1142 facility, noted that humane treatment often led to voluntary cooperation. Prisoners who felt respected were more willing to talk, not under duress, but out of trust. The simple act of being seen as human disarmed them more effectively than any interrogation technique. In letters home, some POWs began expressing doubt about the war. Censors allowed neutral phrases like, "We are being treated well," or "They are not what we were told." These fragments carried immense psychological weight. When German families received such words, they questioned the regime's narrative, the very foundation of Nazi propaganda. For the Americans, this unintentional psychological transformation was perhaps the greatest success. The camps became unofficial schools of democracy, where humanity itself was the curriculum. By 1945, Allied intelligence concluded that exposure to fair treatment had significantly weakened ideological resistance among POWs. The most effective re-education wasn't through lectures, it was through lived example. Within the fences, the war was still present, in memories, in guilt, in the distant rumble of headlines. Yet, something fragile and revolutionary was taking root. In treating their captives as equals, American soldiers had begun to win a quieter, moral victory, one that would outlast the war itself. To the untrained eye, the American POW camps looked like simple detention sites, orderly rows of barracks under watchtowers and barbed wire. But behind the calm routine lay a quiet, deliberate strategy. Humane treatment was not only moral, it was tactical. From the beginning, U.S. intelligence recognized that information came easier through respect than fear. Interrogations conducted at Fort Hunt, Virginia, the facility secretly codenamed P.O. Box 1142, revealed the effectiveness of civility. Interrogators, many of them German-speaking Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution, relied not on violence, but conversation. They offered prisoners cigarettes, good food, and genuine curiosity. In that atmosphere, countless secrets emerged voluntarily. Submarine routes, V-2 rocket data, U-boat refueling schedules. At times, these insights saved Allied convoys or shortened battles. The men who shared them rarely saw it as betrayal. They saw it as a debt to decency. The War Department's internal reports confirmed it. Humane handling improved cooperation. Fear hardened loyalty, but fairness dissolved it. Even in the standard camps, the system worked tactically. The Geneva Convention rules allowed work assignments, and German POWs helped rebuild America's wartime economy. They harvested cotton, repaired rail lines, and cut timber. These tasks served two purposes: meeting the labor shortage caused by millions of American men at the front, and allowing prisoners to maintain dignity through productivity. Commanders understood the psychology. Idle men plotted, working men adapted, and when prisoners worked beside American civilians, something deeper formed, a fragile social bridge between sworn enemies. In towns like Aliceville, Alabama, and Hereford, Texas, local attitudes toward the enemy began to soften. At first, civilians feared escapees and spies. Yet as the months passed, they saw orderly columns of German POWs marching to farms each morning, saluting politely, returning at dusk with clean tools and smile. Farmers who had once cursed Hitler's name now spoke of his soldiers with reluctant respect. The prisoners were disciplined, efficient, and grateful for fair pay. Some locals even brought food for them during holidays. An Alabama newspaper wrote in 1944, "It is strange to see the enemy thank us for kindness, but perhaps this is what victory looks like." Churches sent Christmas gifts and invited POW choirs to sing during services. One Sunday in Georgia, a group of German prisoners performed Silent Night in both German and English, the same carol once sung across the trenches of World War I. Congregants wept. Inside the camp, American officers encouraged recreation and education. Prisoners printed newspapers, painted murals, and played orchestral music. They built models, carved wood sculptures, even published poetry. The Red Cross distributed instruments, and guards often attended concerts. These activities transformed sterile enclosures into living communities. It was not forgiveness, it was civilization, asserting itself over hatred. When the war finally ended, local townspeople would remember these Germans not as villains, but as men who worked their land, shared their songs, and wrote them letters of thanks long after returning to Europe. As 1945 drew near, many German POWs began describing their camps as schools of freedom. Within the wire, they experienced a version of democracy that no Nazi classroom could have imagined. They voted for camp leaders, debated openly, and read American newspapers. In several camps, lectures on literature, politics, and philosophy were organized by the prisoners themselves, using books provided by U.S. libraries. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a German teacher held nightly English lessons. In Aliceville, a POW orchestra played symphonies by Beethoven and Brahms before mixed audiences of Americans and prisoners. One letter preserved by the Red Cross reads, "We learned more about America in captivity than in years of propaganda." Cultural exchanges even reshaped personal identities. Many POWs who had once believed in Nazi supremacy discovered humility through exposure to American diversity. Black guards, Jewish interrogators, and immigrants serving the U.S. Army. It shattered the myth of racial hierarchy they had been taught. The camps became small laboratories of coexistence. A few prisoners secretly wrote essays on democracy, later published in post-war Germany. They described the experience of being treated not as subhumans or conquerors, but as equals bound by the same moral code. For some, that transformation endured for life. After repatriation, dozens returned to the United States, not as captives, but as immigrants. They worked, married, raised families, and sent their children to American schools. Their letters often began the same way. To the land that showed me my enemy could be kind. By the time the war neared its end, the U.S. POW camps had achieved something rare in human history, a moral victory within a military victory. These were not just places of confinement. They were classrooms of conscience, where both jailer and captive rediscovered what it meant to be human. And soon, as the guns in Europe fell silent, that fragile humanity would face its greatest test, when the prisoners finally went home. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe was entering its final and bloodiest stage. American forces were pushing toward the Rhine. German cities lay in ruin, and the myth of Nazi invincibility had collapsed. In the quiet corners of the American South and Midwest, the German prisoners, far from the gunfire, listened to news of their homeland's destruction through shortwave radios and Red Cross bulletins. They heard the names of cities that once defined their childhoods: Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden. Each update carried a mix of disbelief and grief. For some, it was the first time they truly understood the scale of what Germany had unleashed and what it had lost. At Camp Aliceville, guards noticed the change. The same men who once saluted proudly at roll call now stood subdued. The arrogance of victory had vanished, replaced by introspection. One American officer recorded in his journal, "They look at us differently now. Not as enemies, but as witnesses of something bigger than the war." The atmosphere shifted from discipline to dialogue. Prisoners began to approach guards with questions, not defiance. They asked about democracy, about elections, about how a country could remain strong without a dictator. The Americans, surprised by their curiosity, answered as best they could. One sergeant recalled explaining freedom of the press to a group of POWs who had never seen a newspaper not controlled by the state. As Germany collapsed, many prisoners felt torn between guilt and gratitude. They were haunted by what they had served, yet thankful for the mercy shown to them by those they were told to hate. The moment of reckoning came with the fall of the Third Reich in May 1945. The news spread through the camps in stunned silence. Guards expected celebration or despair. Instead, there was stillness. Some prisoners wept, others knelt in prayer. For many, the realization was overwhelming. The nation they had sworn loyalty to no longer existed. The U.S. officers chose compassion over triumph. There were no taunts, no humiliations. American flags remained at half-mast for their own fallen, but no one gloated. Instead, messages of peace began circulating. Chaplains organized services, urging forgiveness, not revenge. One POW wrote later, "When our world ended, the Americans treated us as if ours still mattered." In those final weeks, something extraordinary happened. At several camps, German prisoners requested permission to hold memorials, not for Hitler or the Reich, but for all who had died, on every side. The Americans agreed. Crosses were erected, hymns were sung, and for the first time since the war began, former enemies stood together in mourning. In those moments, the line between victor and vanquished blurred completely. The U.S. soldiers, hardened by battle, watched men they had once fought kneel and cry, and found themselves moved by the same grief. What began as a policy of lawful treatment had turned into a quiet revolution of conscience. The guards learned that power could be exercised without cruelty. The prisoners learned that defeat could coexist with dignity. The war's greatest lesson wasn't written in treaties or surrender documents. It was found behind barbed wire, in the silence of a camp where enemies learned to respect one another. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the announcement reached the American POW camps through radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines. The guards gathered the prisoners in formation. The U.S. flag fluttered above them, its colors bright against the spring sky. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a voice in the crowd, a German non-commissioned officer, whispered the words, "Der Krieg ist aus." The war is over. There was no cheer, no defiance, only the hollow weight of realization. They were no longer soldiers of a Reich. They were displaced men without a nation. Many lowered their heads, not out of fear, but because they did not know who they were anymore. The Americans responded not with celebration, but with restraint. They understood that victory carried responsibility. Within days, camp commanders allowed religious services for peace. Chaplains, American and German, stood side by side, reading from the same Bible. In one service at Camp Tonkawa, both sides recited the 23rd Psalm. The line, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," echoing through the barracks like a shared confession. Soon, the process of repatriation began. The Red Cross coordinated lists, while U.S. trucks transported the first groups to coastal ports. For many POWs, leaving was bittersweet. The land they were returning to was unrecognizable, bombed, divided, occupied. Yet the land they were leaving had shown them unexpected decency. Letters began arriving months later, small envelopes addressed to former guards and officers. They were written in careful English or soft German cursive. "Thank you for how you treated us. Thank you for showing us honor when we had none." Some enclosed hand-drawn sketches of the camps, portraits of their captors turned friends. Others included photographs taken years later, men standing with their families beside American flags, smiling. For some, gratitude turned into life decisions. A number of former POWs applied for immigration to the United States in the 1950s, citing their time in captivity as the reason. One former soldier, Dieter Kruger, wrote, "In that camp, I met America, not its weapons, but its soul." He returned years later as a farmer in Iowa, raising crops with the same hands that once picked cotton under guard. Even American soldiers struggled to explain the connection they had felt. A guard at Camp Aliceville later said, "I came home realizing that the men behind the wire were not my enemies. Hate was." The U.S. Army quietly archived thousands of letters, diaries, and Red Cross reports from the POW program. Together they painted an image of something rare, war transforming into understanding. Historians reviewing those records decades later concluded that the treatment of German prisoners became one of the most successful examples of lawful, humane captivity in modern warfare. The last German POWs left American soil in 1946, waving goodbye to guards who once watched them with suspicion. Some camps were dismantled, others became memorial sites, but their legacy lived on, in the quiet gratitude of men who had learned that honor could survive even in defeat. As the trains carrying the final prisoners rolled east toward the sea, a strange sight lingered. Along the fence line, American guards raised their hands in farewell. On the other side, German soldiers, no longer enemies, saluted back. The war was over. Yet, within that brief exchange, the real victory revealed itself, not in conquest, but in compassion. The guns had fallen silent, but the consequences of war continued to echo across continents. In Europe, ruins marked the skyline of every major city. Millions were displaced, and Germany lay under Allied occupation, divided, hungry, and ashamed. Yet, halfway across the ocean, another kind of reconstruction was already underway, not of cities, but of consciences. The U.S. government's handling of German POWs had created a unique legacy. Historians would later call it the quiet victory, a triumph not won on battlefields, but in the moral space between captor and captive. When the War Department released internal reports in 1946, they confirmed what observers had long noticed. Despite housing nearly 500,000 German prisoners, American camps had maintained remarkably low levels of violence, disease, and unrest. There had been escapes, yes, a few desperate attempts that ended in recapture, but by and large, discipline held because respect held. The Geneva Convention of 1929, once seen as an idealistic piece of paper, had proven its worth in practice. It demonstrated that even during total war, a nation could preserve law and humanity without losing strength. Red Cross inspectors recorded consistent praise for American adherence to standards, a stark contrast to conditions faced by Allied prisoners in Axis. Hands. When the International Committee of the Red Cross published its post-war summary, one sentence stood out: "No other nation held its prisoners with such consistent regard for the dignity of man." but the influence of that policy stretched far beyond paperwork. The treatment of POWs helped reshape how ordinary Germans perceived their former enemies. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as barbaric and greedy, a decadent people lacking discipline or honor. Yet the soldiers who returned home from U.S. captivity told a different story. They described guards who shook hands, officers who kept their word, and chaplains who prayed for both sides. These stories spread through the rubble of post-war Germany, quietly undermining old myths. In a society desperate for moral orientation, the idea that decency could survive even among victors became a revelation. Many historians now credit this as one of the early psychological foundations for West Germany's democratic rebirth. The men who had witnessed fairness in captivity later voted, taught, and raised families with that same belief in lawful order. Meanwhile, in America, the camps themselves left an imprint. Towns that once feared the arrival of Hitler's soldiers now spoke with nostalgia of the German boys who had helped harvest their fields or played Christmas hymns in local churches. A few former guards even traveled to Germany years later to reunite with those they had once watched over. Photographs from those meetings show aging men, some in U.S. veteran caps, others in plain suits, embracing like long-lost friends. The archives of the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General contain hundreds of letters that tell the same story: gratitude. One, written in 1948 by a former POW named Hans Reiter, reads, "You have conquered us not by arms, but by spirit. I pray that Germany will learn from your victory." Behind the statistics and reports, a deeper truth remained. The Americans had proven that victory could coexist with virtue. The decision to treat prisoners as men, not merely as defeated enemies, had paid the rarest dividend of all: respect returned in kind. And yet, this was only the beginning, because for many of those men, gratitude didn't end with freedom. It became the start of a new allegiance. When the last German prisoners boarded ships bound for Europe in 1946, America watched them go with mixed feelings: relief that the war was over, but also a strange sense of farewell. For years, these men had lived quietly on American soil, building fences, planting crops, playing music. They had arrived as enemies and departed as something far more complex, witnesses to the humanity of their captors. For many, the return to Germany was jarring. Their homeland lay shattered, cities reduced to ash, families scattered, futures uncertain. Yet, amidst the ruins, one group of men carried a seed of something new, an understanding of democracy born in captivity. They had seen a nation that wielded power without cruelty, discipline without terror, and freedom without chaos. Historians later noted that these returning POWs, the ones held in the United States, became among the earliest advocates for democratic values in post-war Germany. Many joined local reconstruction councils, became teachers, engineers, or journalists. They helped lay the cultural groundwork for what would become the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. Their memories of fair treatment under American custody shaped their vision of what a just society could look like. One such man was Hans Gobeler, a U-boat crewman captured in 1944. In his post-war memoir, Steel Boat, Iron Hearts, he wrote that his experience as a POW in the U.S. had destroyed every lie Hitler ever told. Another, Erich Maschke, a historian who studied POW behavior after the war, concluded that the humane treatment by Americans transformed countless prisoners into quiet messengers of democracy. This transformation wasn't isolated to individuals. Across the Atlantic, American policymakers understood the long-term impact of their wartime choices. The U.S. Office of War Information documented testimonials from German POWs as part of what they called Operation Homecoming Influence, an effort to ensure that returning soldiers carried with them favorable impressions of America. It worked. Surveys in post-war Germany during the late 1940s showed that former U.S.-held POWs consistently ranked the United States as the most admired occupying power. Even decades later, the gratitude endured. In 1976, for example, dozens of former POWs returned to Aliceville, Alabama, to attend a reunion marking 30 years since the camp's closure. They walked the grounds, now quiet fields, and laid wreaths where barracks once stood. Locals welcomed them like old neighbors. The town band played, and elderly men with German accents embraced Americans who had once been their guards. One of them said softly, "Here, I learned that enemies can be better teachers than friends." Other former prisoners became American citizens. Some married American women they had met during their time as laborers or interpreters. A few served in the U.S. military during the Korean War, fighting under the same flag that had once stood opposite theirs. The ripple effects went even further. The U.S. Army's POW program became a model for future military policies worldwide. The Korean War, Vietnam, and even modern Geneva Convention revisions all drew lessons from how America had handled the German captives of World War II. The premise was simple but profound, that decency under duress was not weakness but strength. By the 1980s, historians revisiting the POW era called it a moral victory without parallel. American archives recorded nearly 6,000 letters of thanks from former German prisoners, some arriving 40 years after the war. Each letter, each handshake, each visit back to those campgrounds told the same story. That kindness, even in war, can outlive the sound of gunfire. The fences were gone. The camps had vanished. But the memory of fairness remained, a quiet proof that mercy, once given, can echo for generations. The war that once divided the world had ended, but in the stillness that followed, a quieter truth began to emerge, one not written in treaties or carved on memorials, but remembered in the hearts of men. Behind the barbed wire of America's POW camps, an extraordinary reversal had taken place. Mercy had triumphed where hatred was supposed to rule. The German prisoners had come expecting vengeance. What they found was discipline without cruelty, strength without arrogance, and victory without humiliation. The Americans who guarded them, often young men who had seen death up close, chose restraint when they could have chosen revenge. In doing so, they revealed something profound, that true power lies not in domination, but in the ability to remain human when war demands you forget how. Historians would later describe those camps as laboratories of decency, but for the men who lived them, they were something simpler, proof that even amid ruin, humanity can rebuild itself. A meal shared, a hymn sung, a handshake offered across enemy lines. These were not grand gestures, yet they became the foundation of reconciliation. Many of those prisoners carried that lesson home, passing it to their children and their country. And in the decades that followed, the same Germany that had once marched under tyranny became one of democracy's strongest voices, shaped, in part, by what its defeated soldiers had learned in captivity. In every era, war reveals the worst in humanity. But sometimes, quietly, it reveals the best. The story of the German POWs in America stands as a reminder that compassion can be as revolutionary as victory, that the moral strength of a nation is measured not by how it fights, but by how it treats those who can no longer fight back. As history fades into memory, one image endures: a German soldier, behind barbed wire, lifting his hand to thank an American guard. No words, just a gesture, small, sincere, eternal. In that moment, the war truly ended.